All right, this morning we're going to go ahead and continue in 1 Corinthians. We're going to be looking at the first part of chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, and the very inventive title of Men and Women in Worship. Hey, isn't that creative? Actually, it does deal with that subject, but again, as we have looked through 1 Corinthians, Paul is always coming back to the same ideas. He's always dealing with, you have knowledge, but if you don't have love that goes along with it, you don't know as you should know. God's wisdom, what does true spirituality look like? You know, are you a spiritual person or not? Or do you just think you are because you think you know so much or because you do so much? Also, whatever you're doing, is it associative with promoting the gospel or interfering with the gospel? Is it loving to your brother or not? What kind of message is it sending to the world? All sorts of things that he's been dealing with. And these same thematics are coming forward here in this lesson. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to go ahead and look at something that we're like, head coverings? What? You know, why would we bother studying that? Well, it's important because, not because of the head coverings themselves, though I do know there are churches and all that, you know, you got to put something on your head. And I appreciate their literalness of those obedience, but I think it's misplaced, as we'll see here, because if you notice, we don't have anybody wearing head coverings here. But again, not going to, if that's what you want to do, go for it. The thing that we're going to see, though, is as we've seen meat or food sacrificed to idols, the same issue is coming up, the same approach. And I'm going to take the same approach that we've been taking through these other passages, because Paul takes the same approach. And I can tell you right now, this section and some later ones we're going to get into, if you start getting down into every single word has to match every single other word, you're going to get your head's going to hurt. Because I read enough commentators this week and last week, and all of their heads hurt. All right? Because each one of them comes, well, if that's true, then this is true, but then that doesn't work. I mean, and if that's true, then this, you know, okay? So in other words, it's really hard. So if you're running into brick walls with passages, typically, what you're going to find is you're asking the wrong question, right? Or you don't have the cultural background to be able to place it in its proper context. Or there's something about the language you don't know. And again, if Paul's writing this, do you think he's trying to write something that's confusing? Hey, Corinthians, I want to straighten you out, so let's write something really confusing, right? Now, why would he be writing something that's not confusing to them, but might seem confusing to us?
Because it's a cultural thing.
Because it's a cultural thing. See, he wrote it to them, and it's for us, right? But it was still to them. And this is where those bridging those gaps we talk about in hermeneutics, you know, so those aren't bugs, by the way. It's an approach of how you handle the Bible. But when we start looking at this stuff, it gets really tricky. So I'm going to take the same approach that we've been taking. Paul is still going through with the same thematics. He's still dealing with love. He's still dealing with knowledge. He's still dealing with the gospel. He's still dealing with care for one another, the presentation of how things are going. And using that same framework that he's been using and applying it to the same language and structures that we have here in this passage, I think we come up with something a lot more understandable and something that's also very applicable. And that's the thing I want to make sure we understand. These passages, even though they're talking about head coverings, are very applicable to us today. All right? It's just now you got to take the principle that he's trying to argue from and help everybody understand how I would then use it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the lesson. Now, what we're going to do, and again, I like David Garland's outline on this section from an argument structure, and you'll see at the bottom of page 1 and then top of page 2 of your notes, the basic argument structure. And if you notice, like it says, every man who prays or prophesies, every woman who prays or prophesies. On the one hand, on the other hand. One hand the man, the other. That's in Greek, that's called a mende construction. In other words, let me explain to you about this, and now let me give you something on the other hand. So I'm giving you a comparison. A man ought not, a woman ought. Neither a man apart from a woman apart from a man apart from a woman. For just as the woman, also thus is the man. Then you get one place that says it's shameful for the woman to pray to God uncovered, and there's no parallel in that same structure for the men, though there are references to it. It's just not paralleled. And then on the one hand, the man, and on the other hand, the woman. So if you notice here, he keeps bouncing back and forth, giving comparison contrast. On one hand this, on the other hand that. This is true, that ought not to. Okay? So if you look at that, if he's making those kind of comparisons and contrasts all through the text, that should give you a clue that that's part of the form of his argument. Now our challenge is, of course, what do each of those components mean and how do they work? And the way I've broken this down is first off, in any type of you're trying to discuss or describe something, you usually set a premise, or there's a set of premises that Paul uses. Remember, Paul's been using those premise arguments. Because of this true about Christ, or because we preach Christ crucified, or etc., therefore, or for this is the premise and therefore I'm going to argue from it. So we're going to look at his premise first. Then we're going to look at the practices, or practice that he says, okay, this is the way it should be. Then we're going to look at his reasoning as to why the practices should be. Then we're going to look at the relationship, because he's going to talk about this in form that I want you to understand there's a relationship as to the whys work. If the relationships aren't there, then the whys are irrelevant. And then finally, some example and conclusions, because again, that's another thing that Paul does in his arguments. He says, okay, well, let me give you some examples. Let me show you why this is true. Here's my example of my life, what I gave up, therefore, what I've told you, look, this is how you apply it. And so, since he's following that same kind of structure in other parts, and when we get to chapters 12 through 14, we'll see exactly the same kind of stuff that's happening, I figure this is probably the most appropriate way to attack this section. Does that all make sense? Okay. Now, there are to use hyperbole, a bazillion different ways people can approach this text. And each and every one of them, if you approach it from a purely what I call linguistic, this phrase says, therefore, I set that as my linguistic premise. And that now controls everything around it. I read so much of that stuff, and everybody ran into some brick wall. All right, so if no matter which way you assume your premise linguistically, you run into a brick wall, probably should abandon the linguistic premise. So that's why we're going with the argument structure that Paul has been using. All right, I know that's a lot of technical stuff, but I think it's going to make this section make a lot of sense. All right, so let's look at his premise. This is beginning in verse 2 and verse 3. It says, now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. And again, the words that are being used here can be for man and woman or wife and husband. They're the exact same words in context. And different translators translate it differently. The same principles work. I think husband and wife make sense in that respect, but man and woman also fit. So don't get hung up again, down into the nits and grits of this. And if it means that, it can't mean something else. What? It fits. Now, what though did he just say? Why in the world did he just say, I commend you? Okay, hasn't he been just chastising them? I commend you. You remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them. He starts off with that. So what do you think he's really doing? All right? Because remember, this is not a letter of, oh, gee, Corinthians, you guys are doing great, right? So when he opens up with that and he says, I commend you that you're remembering me and the traditions I've given you, what would you think that would be? Parents who have to talk with kids or grandparents. No, we just get to spoil them. What do you think? If you were entering into a discussion with somebody, especially after you've just kind of pounded them for 3 chapters on idols and flee idolatry and what you guys are doing is not right.
You want them to listen.
Yeah, you want them to listen. So I think, and there's a lot of other commentators that basically look at this. This is a rhetorical device. Paul's saying, look, I appreciate you guys listen. I mean, because you have listened. Remember, he has not argued against their hearing of what he said, right? Yeah, you got it, you got it, you got it, you got it. Now you don't understand it or understand it or understand it. So he's not going after you've ignored what I've told you. It's just you're not applying it properly. So I commend you. You've listened, you've paid attention. And the traditions, this is not the traditions of the church thing, which a lot of people, look, it says right there is the traditions of the church, and Paul said you follow the traditions. Most likely in that, and you say, if you're talking about what's been going, it's like, this is what we know. This is the truth we know. These are the things we've told you about and what Jesus did and where things are going. They're traditions. In other words, things we've communicated and passed on to you, right? So don't get super technical on that one, because he's just basically saying, what we have told you, what I have told you, I commend you because you've paid attention to it, for the most part. What you haven't done is done it with love. That's what he's talked about during this time, or wisely applied it. And this is the same situation that we're going to see here. Now, though, in verse 3, he says, I want you to understand. So it seems like he's introducing another idea that maybe they haven't gotten. I want you to understand what? That the head of every man is Christ. The head of the wife is the husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, that's a premise, isn't it? If I'm going to start with an argument, why in the world do you just throw that out there unless it's a premise to say, I need to give you the basis of what I'm now going to talk to you about, and look at the basis that he's using. What kind of basis is he trying to use? What kind of is he trying to explain here? I'm going to have to tell you? Honestly, if you get this verse, this then unlocks the rest of the section. If you miss this verse, you're arguing from a different premise. Now, some people say, oh, well, see, we got Christ and we got man and then we got woman. Inferior, superior, right? You think that's what Paul's trying to do? Especially when he starts talking about head coverings and things like that? No, he's not talking about superiority or inferiority, because guess who he puts last in order and still in a quote-unquote subordinate position? The head of Christ is God. So unless you want to turn your Trinitarian doctrine into subordinationism, that Christ is subordinate he's inferior to God, okay, less than, you have to accept the fact that Paul's not talking about inferiority or superiority. What he's talking about is role and relationship, and, as we're going to see, how your role and relationship and behavior that we're going to see reflects either honorably or shamefully, brings glory to or not. So if you notice here, he's not talking about that, okay, a man or a woman is anything or not anything. It says, here is the relationship you need to understand. Christ is the head of the man, the one reflecting. Man is to reflect. Now, that doesn't mean woman isn't too. But again, we're not dealing with those subjects. That's not the point that's trying to be made here. And the woman is the wife of her husband, right? And you're going to see later, he's going to argue that. He's going to say, look, even in creation, there's this reflective, this is a completion. And Christ has what? Is not by his behavior and his life and his perfection reflected the glory to God, right? Everything he's done is to reflect glory to his Father, right? So he's setting out this premise. Now, if you think about that, if you remember these texts, you're going to already start seeing this shame, honor, glory, relationship stuff come out. And that's why Paul uses this up front. Does this make sense to you? Because it's really important. This is going to sort of help you see as we walk through these texts. That's what, whenever you start going, well, gosh, that means this. No. Go back to the premise. The premise is everybody has a head. And in this case, it's interesting, he uses the word head, because what's he going to be talking about? Men putting something on their head and women taking something off their head. So you've got the physical head and the metaphorical head, if you will, being talked about. As you do something with your head, you are affecting your head, one way or another. Isn't that interesting? So Paul not only he's giving us the premise. He's also giving us the structure of how to think, and head, and head. Right? It fits all together. So, does that all make sense? All right. So now, let's look at the practice. In practice, in verses 4 and 5, he basically lays out this. He says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head. Okay? So in other words, if you put something on your head, and we'll talk about the hair versus whatever, but if you put something on your head, you dishonor your head. So which head is he talking about that's being dishonored? Christ. Because he said Christ is the head, and he says if you put something on your head, you're dishonoring your head. Okay? And then, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same as if she were shaven. You're like, oh, what's going on here? So, same thing. If she takes off something off her head, she dishonors her head, i.e. husband. And she might as well be, for that level of dishonor, she might as well shave her head. You're like, how does that all work? Now, have we noticed one of the things that Paul, when he was arguing about idols and idol meat and all that other stuff, didn't he say, the meat is nothing, the idols aren't real, it's irrelevant? So again, he's not necessarily talking about the things as put this on or take that off and this does something or other, unless, what was his argument in dealing with idols? It becomes a stumbling block. It becomes a problem for the gospel. And you're going, how does putting something on your head as a man when praying or prophesying, or taking something off when praying or prophesying as a woman, how does this dishonor your head? And how does this stumble the gospel? And what message are you sending? See? So now he's going to say, okay, here's my premise. Here's what practice and what the result of this practice is. Now let me give you my reasoning. All right, now I'm going to explain to you why I'm saying this. I'm going to explain what's going on. It says, for if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Now, we'll talk about that in a second. And then he goes, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. And you're like, wow. All right, how do I put that together? Am I allowed to have short hair? Can I not? Right? See, this is dragging all of our modern sensibilities into this culture, which is not what's going on, right? In Corinth, and in general of the entire area that the church is at this point in time, and in actually most cultures in many times, it is considered that veil, the head covering, which is, I believe that the best understanding of this is head covering, though it could associate with hair, because there's also adornment and lack of adornment and all that other kind of stuff that, a woman is, it's not about the braiding of the hair and the gold and all the other kind of stuff. But here, he's talking about religious practice. And in this particular society, a woman who took off her veil or her head covering was considered, quote unquote, available, and it was also considered sexually provocative. You could take off your veil around close family and in your house. It wasn't, okay, you got to wear this all the time. The reason you could take it off at home or with close family is because that wouldn't be considered provocative or, hey, I'm available. They know you, they know who you are, right? And so if a woman, took off the veil outside of the home, she was considered available. And when we get to the religious components of this, she would also be very much like a temple prostitute. We'll talk some more about hair and veils and all that kind of stuff. Because we're now talking about what? Praying or prophesying in church. So now you start seeing that if it's dishonoring to take that off, because in this society, again, who was the head of the home? The husband. Who was being dishonored when you did this? Your husband. Because now you're a loose woman, a provocative woman, sexually, etc. Okay, now we'll see how this then starts tying into the gospel. So this whole notion that you start seeing here, if she cut her hair short, in Roman custom, and this is a Roman custom, that an adulterous wife would have her hair shaved off, stripped of her clothing, and sent out of her house by her husband. So when it's talking about she might as well have it shaved, it's like, that's how bad it is, guys. When you do this, that's how bad it is. And you're going, well, something on my head. But remember, in the culture and in the society, this had a massive, massive communication of what you did or didn't do. And I'll talk about some other things here in a second. So in other words, if I genericize this, ladies in church, when you're praying and prophesying, don't violate the modesty mores of your society. So again, that's a beautiful application for us. Okay? It's not, we're not going to, when we get to the application, it's not like how close, just like the wet paint, how close can I get to the edge? It's like, or how can I look like a potato sack? You know, both are extremes, and there's reasons that we don't want to go there. But it basically says, look, this is disgraceful. This brings shame. Yeah.
Would this be the same for single people also, or is it just married people?
Mostly it's married because single women were considered available. That's why a wife wore the veil and a single woman didn't. And so, again, when we get down to it, he's not covering every single scenario. He's talking about, that's the reason I said the most referent is husband and wife. But a single woman was also then under her father. So again, she would have to be bringing dishonor to him. Hey, there's the loose woman kind of a thing. But mostly it's associated with that. Or if it's not associated with the family, it also could be the leaders of the church here. You're looking like a temple prostitute in the service, and here you got these elders that are supposed to be watching over you or caring for you if you didn't have a wife or a husband or a father to take care of you. So again, when we put it in its culture, suddenly all of these weird sounding verses make total sense, right? And again, it's going to be gospel, wisdom, knowledge, practice, and it comes all out of it. He says, and you go, okay, well, let her, she should put something on her head. And, this is one of those situations where you go, I can see why a woman might go, well, it's okay. Can you think of a couple of reasons why a woman might go to a service in a home and might think it's okay to take the veil off? Perfectly logical, legitimate reasons, but still going to be wrong. Again, the Corinthians made perfectly logical reasons and said, nope, you're still wrong. What would be a couple? Can you think of some? Again, we don't know, but just knowing what you know from the rest of Scripture, why might that be something they would think would be okay?
Because they were probably intimate with those people. They knew them very well and had fellowship, so they would know that they were attached to someone. Yeah, they're intimately related to them because what? Brother and sister, right? We're family. We're related. We're part of God's family. They might go and say, you all know me. We know you. It's okay. Right? Perfectly legitimate, right? From that reasoning. Or it could also be that we meet in houses. We're not out in some temple. We're at home. And if it's okay to be at home, why not now? Right? And didn't Paul tell, let's see, the Galatians? Paul writes too many things in too many places. There is no male, no female, no slave, no master. We're all one in Christ, right? So she went like, well, why should our gender distinctions of this and that and the other have any bearing on anything? Right? Aren't we all one? So who cares whether I wear the veil or not? It's a little bit more theologic, but most likely we're family. I don't need to wear the veil. However you do,
because it's going to be a big deal. Not so much for you or even those around you. It's for others. It's the gospel. And it also, if this shames your husband in public, if you did it, you're in public. You're shaming your husband. You are saying, I'm available, guys. And this may sound weird, but I'm sure you've seen it in churches or anywhere. Ladies, whatever is considered provocative, avoid it. Whatever it is. Taking the veil off and showing your long hair was provocative. Do you want to try to stumble all the men around you? Sorry, guys or ladies, we're that way. Why try to stumble a brother? And so here, if that's considered provocative in their society, why be provocative? See, that's just loving your brother. By not letting your brother start going, you know, that's not what you should be doing. So again, just love for others. Now you see how Paul's doing this. Now, look what he then says, for a man ought not to cover his head. You're like, okay. Since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. Again, this is that reflective, who she is. What was she? We're going to see here, he's going to make some arguments from nature here later. But anybody who sees this behavior from a woman or a man, because the man, and again, there's 1,000 different ways this can argue. I'm going to throw one out that I think fits the best. In pagan practice, emperor worship, you name it, a man typically in Roman culture would take his toga and put up over his head, bow his head, and pray or prophesy from that position. Okay? So, for a man to do this, what would it look like? Praying to the pagan gods, right? Matter of fact, Roman emperors' statues, many of them have that toga over the head with the head bowed to show piety. So now what do you have? You have a situation that you say, all right, if you are praying looking like a pagan, what kind of reflection is that to everybody, to God? You look like everybody else, don't you? You pray like everybody else. You are covering up and bowing and looking pious, and yet the reality is anybody watching would say that's what everybody does in the temple. Remember the meat? What was the problem? Gosh, I'm accepting your God because I'm eating that meat. The woman who takes off the head covering, what is she going to look like? She's going to look like the temple prostitute or priestess, the loose woman. Because remember, temple prostitution wasn't, hey, it's just prostitution. It was religious ritual. Okay, and there's a lot behind it. We don't have time to cover in class. But that was not just, hey, let's go have sex. This was religious practice for a purpose. Okay? So guess what, ladies? If you come in looking like that, you're going to look just like the ladies in the temple. And if the guys put the thing over their head, they're going to look just like the pagan men praying and prophesying. So if you notice here, what is now being set up for the Corinthians that Paul's saying, are you reflecting Christ, men? Are you bringing honor to him? No, you look like a pagan. Ladies, are you bringing honor to your husband? No, you look like a temple prostitute. Does this make it a little clearer why the head coverings were such a big deal? I don't want to lose anybody. Does this making sense how Paul's making these arguments? And again, we have to set ourselves in their culture to have that backdrop. Otherwise, it's the polar bear in the snow. You get to these turns, you see the eyes and the nose, but the rest of it blurs out. Well, if you put something behind him, you can see it's a polar bear, right? Well, here, you can now start seeing that this is in worship, remember. It doesn't say, guys, you can't put anything on your head. It says, when you're praying or prophesying, I look all pious. I look like the pagan men, because that's how they did it. So he says, all right, don't do that. You shouldn't be looking that way. Because what? You're the image and glory of God. In other words, you were created in His image, and you are to bring glory to Him. You are to honor Him. And when you do this, you're not. And ladies, you are the glory of the man. You're the one who's supposed to honor him. And in society, you would not be. He's not saying women are not created in the image of God. A lot of people go, whoa, how come it's men in the image and glory? That's not the point of this argument. So he's trying to keep you in the Christ is the head of the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ, right? See how this all fits? All right. I put one of my favorite idioms in the notes here, that whether any of this was true or not, just like the meat sacrifice idols, it's nothing, it didn't mean anything. Not the woman is being promiscuous, not that the guy is trying to be a pagan. A lot of people, I got to bow my head and lower my voice and change my tone when I pray. I don't get it, but, okay. Well, I'm putting the thing over my head and I'm being prophesying and I'm praying. But to anybody watching, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Regardless of whether it is a duck or not. The perception is that true. When I was in the defense industry years ago, in the D.C. area, we used to have a thing. People would argue, oh, it's okay, it's legal, you can do it, it's fine, there's no problem. We go, yeah, you're right. And then we said, Washington Post test. And you're like, what in the world are you talking about? Well, that was the code that says, if what you just did or plan to do showed up on the front page of the Washington Post, the main newspaper in the D.C. area, what perception would you give? Even if you're legal and correct and you did it right and all the other stuff, what perception would you give? And people are like, wow, people would think we're, lying, cheating, stealing, whatever. You're right. Washington Post test. Quacks like a duck. All right? So, again, this is what Paul's trying to say. Guys, be careful about how you behave in worship and what you do, even though it really doesn't matter. Does it matter if the guy has something over his head? No. So does it matter if you're amongst brothers and sisters that you had something off your head? No. But everybody else sees dishonor. Everybody else sees you're just like us. Right? Now, some application with that. Clearly, as Paul has been talking about, and in the most general sense, our behavior and how we honor each other, or our husbands, our wives, our parents, the church, our co-workers, etc., etc., etc. Just in the most general sense, what are we reflecting when we do it? Right? So, we're talking a specific thing, so I'm just generalizing the same principle. What does it look like when you do that? Are you honoring God? Are you inhibiting the gospel? Are you looking like a rascal? Blah, 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 etc. So in just general sense, if we just take that principle and ask ourselves that question, what does this look like? Is this honoring or is this shameful? Ask those two questions. Well, maybe I shouldn't do that. Just like Paul said, I'm going to back away from my rights. And again, this isn't, guys, this is not what I call pathedosac theology, because we're going to get to that in a second. Paul is not saying you can't dress nice. Is he? He's saying this clothing, as you're using it, one way adding or other way subtracting, sends a message. So, say you move to a country where red was offensive or was the color of a prostitute. Ladies, when you went to work, church, oh, sorry, you're wearing red. Got reds, pinks, and you got red. It's Christmas. Sorry, I picked the wrong color. It's a Christmas. But say if red was that color in that society, would you want to come to church wearing red? Probably not. And again, there's nothing wrong with the color red. Red's a beautiful color, Not a problem. So again, he's just basically saying, whatever society you're in, whatever culture you're in, Be modest. Don't be offensive in it. Don't send the wrong message. Don't say, I look like a pagan, I walk like a pagan, I talk like a pagan, but I'm not a pagan because I'm a Christian. You know. Try to avoid that association if you can. So, question.
Does that apply then to how we live our lives when we're trying to live our lives Christ-like, and swearing, gossip, just being pulled in by all those other things just in order to feel accepted?
Yeah, and exactly right. Because remember, what did we talk about at the very beginning of this class? What was wisdom? Looking, behaving, and thinking as God would see things. So if he says, don't use coarse language, avoid it. Don't use coarse language, because what does it send the message? You're like everybody else. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do the these and the thous and the holiest, By the way, just as a cultural and historic linguistic background, the these and the thous in the Bible, in the King James Bible, and also in Shakespeare, that actually is the last time structure that those words are used in modern English during that time period. Matter of fact, those words had already vanished from most common language. And a lot of the time we look at this and say, oh, that's the holy language of the Bible. We must talk to these and the thous. I hate to disappoint you, but that was Middle English from which it came from. That was considered language of familiarity and relationship and closeness. So when the translators of the King James Bible used the these and the thous, they were saying, here's our closeness and our relationship to God. When they used thou and thee and all that kind of stuff, they were saying how close we are, not how holy he is. It's interesting. That's what we've turned it into. But that's not why they wrote it that way. Just a linguistic thing. So these and thous are relational, not separation. It's kind of cool. But if you think about this, and here comes my potato sack theology. Ladies, dress nice, dress appropriately. Men, dress nice, dress appropriately. Be gracious, be loving. If what you're doing looks like paganism associated with something else, etc., avoid it. But that does not mean that now, because I can wear potato sacks, look how simple my garments are, because I'm not going to be dressing fancy. I'm so simple, I'm down to the gunny sack, and look, I'm being, what are you really doing? Drawing attention to yourself. And what is this whole thing about? The gospel. About honoring your husband. About being gracious. See? And so what you're really doing when you do that, and I, again, appreciate people who say, I want to be as modest as I can, great. But that's not the point Paul's trying to make here, is it? He's trying to say, dress modestly, dress appropriately, dress honoringly in those specific things. But in general, everything that you do should be thought in those ways. Am I bringing honor to God? Am I being glorifying in what I do? Is my speech seasoned with grace, etc., etc., etc.? Because the world is watching, and you are reflecting on somebody. Your boss, your husband, your wife, your kids, your parents, etc. So you see how he's using those same principles for head coverings, and we can use the same principles for life. Right? So again, this is important. Now, one last little comment, and this is again not trying to pick on ladies, but Roman law of this day, they had law. The Roman legal system was very sophisticated. It was centuries, millennium before anything equivalent came about after the fall of Roman Empire. Here's how not wearing a veil affected a judicial crime of whether it's rape or unwanted sexual advance or whatever. If a woman did not wear her veil when she was out, the man, rightly or wrongly, but this is Roman law, could give the defense, I thought she was available, and get off. So in other words, you just advertised yourself as available. What did you expect? And I'm not trying to say anything beyond that, but I'm just saying that's how important it was. So the veil actually was a protection for a modest Christian woman to wear. So nobody could ever say, I thought she was available. Well, I saw you in church doing that. It says you're available. You know, see how reflective both in society and for protection and love and care and all. Even in this society, these things came about. All right. Relationship. For a man is not made from woman, but a woman from man. Neither was the man created for woman, but the woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, the woman is not independent of the man, nor man of woman. For the woman was made from man, so the man now is born of woman, and all things are from God. Now, believe me, these are not simple passages. But if you notice here, he's setting a set of relationships up, isn't he? He's saying, look, there's why you should do this and why I've given you these examples. Why? Because in creation, God created everything. And that's why he says all things are from God, right? I am the creator and I've set them up for a purpose and role and function, right? And what did I do? I said, I didn't make the man for the woman. I made the woman for the man. In other words, we go back to Genesis. What's the account? There was no one for Adam. Here's the woman. All right? She completes him. So if you notice, there's no inferiority or anything like that. It's just, here's your role, right? A completer. And neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. So he's just basically going back to the same, here's what God's purpose was. So again, if you notice what his premise was, the man's the head of the woman, and therefore when she does this, it's a shameful thing. See? It all fits together. That's why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Okay. Isn't that a wonderful passage? Okay. I have read so many different arguments on this one as to what that means. I got tired of reading them. However, we could just be very simple and say we have absolutely no idea why Paul said that. That was the coward's way out. But now I'm going to give the humble way out. Can't tell you the answer, but I can give you something that I think fits with everything else we've seen and all the stuff we're going to see, and fits with their society and their culture and everything else. I'm not going to tell you that's the answer, but I'm going to give you something that I think fits well. Okay. He says, you ought to have a symbol of authority. Okay. Now, this is not a symbol of subjugation, all right? And symbol and authority and all these other words get, munged together, and that's not what the Greek actually says, but that's translator's best shot at it. Okay? In Jewish thinking, and in many other pagan groups, not all, but many of them, the understanding that angels were watching what was going on, because angel actually means messenger. You guys realize that. That's why when Rhoda came to the door and she said, oh, Peter's here. And they said, no, it's his angel. The translation, it was, no, it's his messenger, because that's how you would have communicated from prison, sent a messenger. And you have entertained angels. You have entertained messengers. You have entertained people you don't realize who they were. Okay, that's my view of those. This same idea here is the angels, though, and these are divine angels, not angel messengers, human. But angels are watching and observing. And we have scriptural support for that, right? Angels long to look into these things. In their culture, they saw that angels were be part of worship. The Jews did, and many of the pagans. Okay? So if he's saying you need to have a sign of authority because of the angels, okay, and if this is, again, what Paul's trying to get at, he's now going and he's saying, look, I know the angels are watching, and they are to bring glory to God, and they are longing to look into these things, and they are things, they want to know what it looks like to be forgiven of sin and live, and all those things they're longing to look into. All right? Does this now start to make sense? If that's what they're looking at, you need to behave in a way that shows what you're doing is bringing glory to your husband as your husband is bringing glory to Christ, as we then see how the orderliness that God has put in creation, which he's just argued, and that this is a beautiful thing for us to understand. Does that make sense? Therefore, don't take the veil off. Because angels want to see how God is working his glorious plan out, and you are living in according to that. Does that make any sense at all? I think it flows much easier. I think you don't have to debate 1,000 things. You just go, here's what the society would think. Here's how they thought. And if Paul's doing that, because we do have scriptural evidence, the angels are looking into these things. And so you come back to that, and you see that that is most likely, I believe, the best answer. Now, so that nobody ever questions as to whether Paul is dealing with roles and responsibilities or authority or anything, he wants to ensure the Corinthians don't misunderstand him again. Good, Paul, we've got it, and run off down another path. He says, nevertheless, even with all of this stuff, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent from man, nor man from woman. In other words, you are joint heirs. There is no distinction from that. For as a woman was made from man, now man is born from woman. And all things come from God. In other words, guys, we all have our roles. We have our relationships. Don't think anybody's more superior than the other. Hey, do you think he's going to apply this same principle later on when he starts talking about spiritual gifts? Yeah, he is. See, if you notice, all of Paul's arguments all fit together. They're just a lot harder to fit together than what we're used to. So he comes back and he says, nevertheless, folks, don't forget. You are not independent of each other in the Lord. You are codependent on each other. Yes, woman came from man, but man comes from woman. So guys, don't get so smart on yourselves that you think one's better than the other. You're not. All right? So, he closes out, as Paul typically does, with some examples and a conclusion. And in verse 13, he says, judge for yourselves. In other words, again, he comes back to appeal. He says, all right, you guys judge for this. You think about this. I figure you're going to figure it out. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? All right. You're going, okay, I kind of think I get the picture here. But he says, now let me give you an example. Now this is where it's an example, not an argument. Does not nature itself teach you that a man wears his hair long? It is a disgrace for him. But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. And for her hair is given to her as a covering. All right. So if you sit here and go, okay, is he trying to make another argument? Well, in a sense, yes. But what he's really going, he says, look, does not nature teach? Now, all of us scientific people know that women's hair and men's hair grow at the same rate, and men can have long hair and women can have short hair, right? You think that's what he's trying to get to? Okay, so let's not bring the modern, I know scientifically what he's trying to say is in our society, the norm, the natural thing, the thing that we all look around at, and all things we associate with, are women have beautiful long hair, because that's typically how they wore it. And the women who wore the short hair were the prostitutes, or the rebellious ones, or etc. Okay? That's not saying a comment on how we wear our hairstyles today. All right? It's talking about their culture. And in their culture, a woman who wore short hair was not looked upon favorably. And a man who wore long hair was not looked upon favorably. Matter of fact, they were looked at as being effeminate. It's interesting, in one of the galleries of some of the conquered peoples that depict in statues and reliefs of conquered people, all the men have long hair. Because they were weak. That's why we conquered them. They were effeminate. It's really interesting. When you look at it, the picture of a weak man in their culture was a guy with long hair. And a rebellious woman was one with short hair. Glory to the woman with the long hair, honor and masculinity to the man with short hair. Or you have short hair dude up, guys, putting gold in whatever. That would be considered more effeminate. So again, what he's basically saying is everybody in our society recognizes this. That's why he says nature teaches, because that's how they approached it. Right? Could not women all have bald hair and we all have bald hair? See, again, it's not about the hair. It's what is it communicating in our society. In their society, it was really clear. Okay, ladies. Okay, gentlemen. Would it make any sense for a woman to go without their veil?
No.
And the answer would be no. It's not hard. But, again, closes out with another rhetorical device. If anyone, in verse 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the other churches, okay, of God. So he's basically saying, look, and this is a rhetorical thing, is if people would say, well, the person who can't be convinced, you never run into any of those people, right? It doesn't matter. I can give you 5,000 arguments, and you go, yeah, but you're wrong. How do I defeat that? If you propose to be I've given you all these reasons, I've given you these examples, I've shown you what it looks like, I've shown you how it affects the gospel, I've shown you all these different things, and you still want to be contentious. All right, we're going to do majority rules. Nobody else does this in any of the churches. We all see the same thing because of the way this reflects on Christianity and the husband and the wife and the roles and everything else. None of us have any other practice. So if you want to be contentious about it, fine. You're going to stand there by yourself. Now, if you notice here, this is not about head coverings, is it? This is about the gospel. This is about honor. This is about bringing glory to Christ, to husbands, to wives, to the people you deal with and interacting with. And he says, so if you want to be contentious about it, we have no other practice anywhere. There's no other tradition. We teach nothing else. So if you guys think this is we're picking on the poor Corinthians, we're not. So you can go to Thessalonica and they're going to do the same thing. In Philippi, they're going to do the same thing. And in Jerusalem, they're going to do the same thing. You go to Rome, they're going to do the same thing. That's what we teach. Okay. Hopefully that made sense. Hopefully that fits together, and we're going to continue as we move on, especially chapters 12, 13, and 14. Oh my goodness, chapter 14. We're going to see these same things come up again and again and again. The same type of arguments, the same type of structure, the same type of gospel-centered thinking. I'm hoping you're beginning to see that you can simplify a lot of stuff when you're asking yourself questions, how should I then live, if you will? Yeah, we're coming back to, am I looking at it from God's perspective? Do I really care about other people when I'm doing this? What kind of message am I sending? Just asking ourselves those few questions. And, of course, knowing what the Scriptures also say about things. Again, we can't ignore knowledge, but there's knowledge with wisdom in love. We take those three things and put them together. Life becomes a lot simpler. Difficult problems become much easier. Texts like this unravel to be clear as opposed to difficult. And again, the problem here is without the cultural background, some of this stuff is like, I could guess 1,000 ways and I wouldn't be able to tell you. And that's why without that background, you end up with those situations. So again, that's where I'm going to try to keep this as we just continue to move on.